Rahubat, Ranani Kawun Sakensa Kamreye. My name is Sakensa Kamreye, one of the millions of student teachers of the master teacher, Parna Babyanun, Dr. Malachi ZK York, and we are here to share the doctrine of Wu-Sabat, to share the knowledge which we refer to as right knowledge, as opposed to wrong knowledge, the right wisdom and the right understanding, so that you can actually take charge of your life by way of your mind and the decisions that you make that are ultimately going to liberate you or keep you in slavery, mental slavery and physical slavery. So it's a pleasure, as always, to answer the questions that have been sent in. You can always send your questions in, film yourself asking 3 questions and upload them to osmvision.wetransfer.com. All right, let's get into the questions for today.
Rahubat Sakin, Rahubat. My name is Christine. I'm from South Africa. I'm a descendant of the Sans people. However, today the modernized groups are called colored people. We need to classify ourselves as colored people in documents whatsoever. But my first question is, uh, what relation do the Sabians and the Sun people have, if there are any, and also with the Rizqians? What part does the Rizqian place in the development of the Sun's people? Because I know you mentioned, and also in the books of Panabab Yanun, they mentioned that the Sun's people were the first beings who inhabited planet Earth. My second question would be,
Okay, Rahubat. Right, so the first question is relating to the Sans people and their relationship to the Rizqians, and the fact that, well, what we actually say about the Sans people is that when you look at everyone on the planet, the traits that everyone has in terms of genetically, they all go back to the Sans people. However, how did life begin on the planet? The life on the planet in terms of humans, we have to explain that even though we say humans, there are different classifications of beings, and the highest being supreme beings, to beings, to human beings, to humans, to man, to mammals, to mankind, sorry, to mammals, to animals, and all sorts of beings in that hierarchy. So the first beings that we refer to as hominoids or humans, we have to go back to, so before beings like that on the planet, there were other types of beings, because the planet was a water being, right? It was completely a water planet. So there were beings evolving in the waters, and also the planet itself came from another planet, and that came from another planet. There's a TikTok video I've already done on this that goes into a lot of detail in terms of how stars grow, expand, explode, and then, or even before that, even the galaxies, the universe. So you have to go back from what we're calling life. There are different types of life forms before we get to who we are today, right? So early Earth was methane and dealing with just, like I said, a water planet. Single cells evolved, etc., etc., etc. Now, those single cells and amoebas and algae, they evolved and they have their timelines. But if you're looking at the galaxy and the universe, these come from other galaxies and other universes. So in our solar system, we have many planets. And, there are debates about life on other planets before we even get into life, different life forms in other galaxies and universes, right? So to answer the question, the Natharu, who we refer to as the overseers, they're the highest of the highest beings throughout the different universes and cosmos, right? They seeded this planet by way of their DNA. Now, they came from a planet called Risk. And Rizqians are beings on Risk. But when you get to talk about Risk, and the only way you even know about Risk is because a being that has come from Risk or that originated from there is here. And he is teaching us and telling us about these things, these beginnings that go back millions and millions of years. You can read this in like the Holy Tablets, you can read it in the Black Book Part 1 and 2, and information that is taken way outside of circular information that just teaches you basic information like the Bible, the Quran, which tries to tell you about the beginnings of life and the universe, but they don't really go into the details of before that, 6,000 years ago, right? So they just give you a very simple story of there's a being called God or Allah or Yahweh or whatever, that he just created the world in 6 days. But anyway, under scientific scrutiny, that doesn't make sense. So you're dealing with a being that comes from there and is able to give you records and so much information that has now, over the many years, been verified and confirmed, right? So these beings that lived on Risk has different types of beings and different continents, 3 in particular that, like here we have continents, Africa, Asia, Europe, etc. You had 3 continents known as Zarantu, Cosmusta, and Donorea, okay? And depending on what type of being you are, how you evolve, remember the atmosphere you're in kind of governs the environment and the composition that you're made up of, right? So when you look at us and look at ourselves, we are made up of oxygen and hydrogen and all the elements that are in the periodic table. We are made up of those. So we have one sun in our solar system, the major sun, right? Other solar systems have, like in the case of Risk, it has 3 suns. So the beings are going to evolve differently and look differently. And you can go to another galaxy or another star system where they look differently based on the environment that they're in. So anyway, these higher beings known as the overseers or the Rizqians, they shared their planet with other beings who were seeking refuge, like their sun exploded or, they had to move. Like right now, wars are going on in different parts of different continents and different parts of the world, and people are taking refuge, say in Europe and in America, and people are starting to complain, you guys are coming in, you're straining our resources, you're taking over this, taking over that. It's the same thing that happens on the galactical level. And the same setup where you have beings from different galaxies that form councils and like the Intergalactic Council, like here we'll have the United Nations. So it's pretty much the same way, but these beings sometimes housed like reptilian beings and beings that had a problem with their solar system and they had to leave. Sirius A, Sirius B, Sirius C, there were stories that explain what happened in those places and they had to seek refuge. The Anunnaki had to try and find gold to try and repair the ozone layer that was depleting, for an example. Anyway, so these Rizqians, the highest ones, the overseers, we refer to as the Natharu, they seeded this planet by putting their DNA and their genes into a Vulcan being or a dolphin, as we know them, because this was a water planet and they had these types of beings had already evolved, the Meldekians, etc., right? So the genes were put into a capsule, inserted into a dolphin, and the dolphin brought them to this planet. The word dolphin, when you research, it actually means womb, because it's the one that had the cells in this womb and brought it down here into this water planet at the time. This planet has evolved. It's known by many names and has taken different forms since that time. It was known as Tiamat, it was known as Terra, it was known as Ard. It's been known by many, many, many names, right? So anyway, they seeded the planet. The cells then dissolved and grew, just like you can actually take yeast or bread and produce life, you know, because the mold, and you know, you see it. But anyway, so that's what happened. And then you're talking about millions and millions of years of evolution, and then the beings then had like catastrophes, like, you know, meteorites hitting. They noted, this is why they can actually go back in terms of watching early Earth based on looking backwards. So these meteorite or tsunamis hit the planet. Some were due to wars that were taking place from other beings in different galaxies fighting, much like today, still going on. There are wars in the skies, wars on the planet, wars in the inner planet, on the inner world of the planet. So I'm trying to make a very long story quite, you know, succinct and summarize it. So when these tsunamis happen, certain beings that were in the waters, they got thrown onto land and evolved. And when you go back to looking at who was here first, and the stories of different races talking about how they came to be and how they evolved, because stories are relayed from ancestors going back generations. So for example, if you looked at the beings that talk about like the Dogons, for example, they talk about Nomo coming out of the water, and then you know, because they came from the Sirius, they actually have maps talking about Sirius A and Sirius B and C and so on and so forth, right? But we, as the original beings that evolved from the water first, you get those stories in ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt is surrounded by mystery in terms of the architecture, the pyramids, the things that they were doing, and that are written in records and written on the walls of Egypt, written in stone. They tell you about how they evolved by the beings that came from Orion and Sirius. But anyway, so those early people, if you go to the Egyptian stories, because when you look at the Egyptian stories of the beginnings and then compare those to like the biblical and the Quranic stories or the Anunnaki stories or the Dogon stories or any other, you'll see that the Egyptians go way back than everybody else. And they talk about the frogs and the snakes coming out of the water, and these were referred to as the Ogdoads, right? And they were known as Pataites eventually. And it's from them that everyone evolved, but especially in South Africa, because when these ancient beings came here, they crashed in the planet. It was all together in terms of the continents weren't separated by then by what we call today continental drift, or dealing with Pangea, right? So the center was where today you call like Egg Island, dealing with Monodapa when you're dealing with South Africa. And so those beings evolved into what you're calling the Sans people. And from them, we're going in different directions, and then other beings mixing with them basically formed the different races on the planet. And let me see if I can find something that I can read Well, let me listen to your second question, and then I might double back to this. Well, let's see the second question.
What role also did the Anunnaki play in the genetic modification of the Sun's people? Were those beings who were here, that the Anunnaki altered them and they became the Sun's people? Or what? Could you just clarify on the timeline of when the Anunnakis came and what was already here on planet Earth with relation to the Sun's people?
Okay, yeah. So that's a great question. That's what I was saying. That by the time the Anunnaki arrived, the Pataites were already here, the descendants of the Rizqians, and the Anunnaki. You said timeline, right? The crash of Nibiru is going back 24 billion years ago, right? So they had to take beings that were already here and evolving and take their genetics. That's why I said in South Africa and Monodapa, where they were actually taking these beings and then splicing and creating different hybrids. And some of them didn't work, as in they came out wrong, because remember, they were trying to produce a being that could use tools, that could operate and think for themselves, because they needed a being to help with mining the gold that they needed to go and repair their ozone layer that was depleting. So they had to take those beings that were already here and mix their DNA to produce. They refer to the beings that the one that when they finally got to the perfection, it's just all genetic splicing and genetic engineering, but they refer to the being like a Lulu Amilu, which means primitive worker, and he had to be able to use tools, etc., etc. So that's the part that the Anunnaki played in terms of taking something that was already here to breed these primitive workers. And of course, there were conflicts between the brothers Enlil and Enki and the different Anunnakis, and doing all these experiments, because even like the other family members like Nagal and Rishkigal, these were also geneticists, and they were in what they refer to as the underworld carrying out these experiments. But you also had other beings that that came from other star systems, because once people found this planet, other beings also started to come here. So you had the Hindu beings coming, and they landed in what you call India today, and they started to mix with the original Pataites to produce different beings. You had those original in Africa, as we said, the Pataites by way of the Rizqians or the elders. Then you had, reptilians and Pleiadians, so that also started to come. And again, they were also producing beings, like we mentioned, the Adamites, which came later on. So in the Bible, there are two different Adamite stories, or two different Adams. But 6,000 years ago, we're talking about the latest Adamites with the Pleiadians and beings from Arcturus and the reptilians, etc. But let me read something. This is from an old scroll from Parnabab Yanun called the Baptism Ceremony, which relates to your question. So it says, the people who came down from the skies, because these beings that came down, they would use words like Elohim back in the day when he was teaching us this, right? But dealing with these Anunnaki. And the ancient Egyptians' name for them was Neteru. So when we're dealing with the Neteru, we're talking about the Natharu, right? And you had the beings like the Atumites, right? Because remember, in the story of the gravitation, you had the Adam and Eve story, you had Zakar, or his parents was Atum and Lilith. So the Atomites were the product of the rape of these Nephilims that came down. That when we're saying Nephilims, we're talking about the Anak or the Anakites or these Anunnakis. And this is, you'll find this in Genesis 6:4. And the Dogon, which I mentioned already, the Nephilims were raping these beings, and the Atomites mixed in with the Hindus. Remember, I also mentioned that these Hindus, the shaggy beast people of the star constellation Orion, right? So again, we're talking about, we got a book called, what's it called? Gosh, the name escapes me, but it's dealing with these shaggy beings from Sirius and Orion. It says that's why you have half of the Egyptians, the Sudanese, and the Ethiopians of today with straight hair, because they mixed. The Nephilims that went onto the freshwater side went down to South Africa, okay? And he says all of this took place thousands of years before the procreation of the human beings, which took place 42,000 years ago. Because remember, when we're saying 42,000 years ago, we're talking about that that they say 6 days in the Bible, but we know that one day is unto the Lord as 1,000 years, as is mentioned in 2 Peter's. So a whole cycle of a week, right, will be 7,000 times 7,000, which will give you 49,000 if you're dealing with the 7 days. But if you minus a day, you're going to get 42,000, yeah? Because if you add another week, another 7,000, and also that's another cycle, you get 49,000. But anyway, let me keep going. So by the time Zakar and Hawa, which is what people are calling Adam and Eve, remember Hawa, she was from the product of the Pataites, yeah, from Anath and Patar, right, referred to as the Pataites, were bred. Many beings had come from different galaxies. So by the time we get to Zakar and Hawa, or Adam and Eve, many beings had come from different galaxies and constellations who were agreeable, okay? And then it goes on to what I was saying, that in the inner world, right, in Shambhala or Agatha, referred to as Ishara, the elder scientist Nagao, right, who is also the Anunnaki, he removed the gland in order to make you zombies as a punishment for being disobedient. And this goes on to say, you are no longer a supreme being, you are a human being. After the gland was removed, Zakar and Hawa were not sent from that point they were sent from that point to Mecca, also called Iridu, right? Iridu means home away from home. The main seat of power, which was Saudi Arabia, or Rafalai, the ancient name of South Africa, yeah? They were blessed with another chance, and their other 20 sons and 20 daughters were sent to work in the mines. This is what I was saying. You can find this in Genesis 5:4. In Monodapa, or Rafali, also called Zimbabwe. All right? And you can find that in Genesis 5:4. So that just gives you a little excerpt. And in fact, you can even find a lot of that in the scroll called the baptism ceremony. It's a small scroll from a long time ago that the master put out. Yeah, so yeah, I hope that helps, because you're dealing with the original Rizqians, and then the Anunnaki came, and they're all mixed with these beings that were evolving on the planet known as the Pataites, which became the Sans people. Another scroll, the Proverbs of Yanun, where he gives the map of how, these beings spread and came onto land from Egg Island and then went into different directions. So get hold of those scrolls and you'll get even more information. All right, let me go to your last and final question.
And then my third question would be, were there any great kingdom in Southern Africa that ruled once upon a time of the Sun tribes, not the Xhosa or the other black groups? Like today we have the Xhosa, the Sothos, the also all those other tribes, the Vendas and all those. But I'm talking specifically about the Sun people? Were there any great kingdoms of the Sun people who once ruled here in Southern Africa? Tak.
Okay, you have to recognize when we say kingdoms, that was really something that was introduced much later by way of divisions and separations, and then now you had kings. So kings come by way of kingdoms, but back at that time, we didn't really have those types of separations. So kings and divisions of land and empires and emperors and like what you have today, that came by way of colonization and by way of divisions of land. But at that period, really Africa was united and one. And it's only through the divisions, which came much, much later on, and then in more recent time in the 1600s and 1400s, dealing with Prince Henry and, dealing with colonization of Europe and people now being placed as kings. And a lot of the kings were actually set up to be utilized by the colonizers, because certain kings were then given certain gifts and given certain positions and power, and then they started to rule over, their people. But yeah, read that scroll and read the holy tablets and read the Proverbs of Yanun, and it will give you more information. But by the time we got to kingdoms, you're talking about, for example, beings like Mansa Musa and very rich people that then had influence. But yeah, really at that time there weren't really kingdoms as such. Later on, you started to get like the kingdoms of like Benin in dealing with like Africa and Yoruba and Europe. I mean, not Europe, like Nigeria, and then you started to have these separations of us as a people, and then the Ghanaian and the kingdom started to come into place. So you had like South Africa, you've got Ghana, Nigeria, and all these other places that came once, Africa was divided. But yeah, we used to mainly rule as one together. All right. Yeah. Thanks for your questions, and I'll happy for you to, send more questions in. Anyone who would like to send their questions in, please do so. Film yourself asking 3 questions, upload them to osmvision.wetransfer.com, and we'll get those answers for you.